today on Online for Authors, I'm chatting with Cynthia Reeves, author of The Last Whaler. Welcome, Cynthia.
Hello, Terry. It's nice to be here.
I am so excited to have you. Before we really delve into your book and your books, because I've read more than one of yours, why don't you give a quick little elevator pitch as to what a reader's going to find when they open up the book, The Last Whaler?
It's essentially a novel about surviving an Arctic winter in 1937-38 on a remote station at a place called Vannkulenfjorden on Svalbard, which is an archipelago about midway between the northern coast of Norway and the North Pole. And it's a couple that gets stranded there for a variety of reasons, including misjudging ice conditions. And so they have to survive not only the polar darkness, which is 24 hours in that latitude, but also all sorts of threats, the storms, the bitter, bitter cold, polar
The
bears,
animals.
animals, the polar bears especially. Just finding food to get them through the winter because they hadn't anticipated being stranded.
Yeah, the idea of being stranded in a place where it's dark for 24 hours a day actually makes me feel intensely claustrophobic and want to run screaming. So I enjoyed the book, but there were parts of it, to me, it was almost a thriller because the idea of being trapped that way. I know that you had an opportunity to do a residency in Svalbard, and I want to know, did the book idea come from that residency, or did you have the idea before you went there?
It came from the first residency. I've actually been there 4 times now. So the first residency was this really interesting, still going on. It's called, it's sponsored by thearcticcircle.org. You have to put the there because there's another Arctic Circle organization that has a similar website. So for artists and scientists who might be interested in exploring the Arctic in this way, what it involves, I went in 2017, and my interest was a lifelong interest in the Arctic, but I had never written anything set there until one morning I woke up after reading Hampton Sides's In the Kingdom of Ice, which is the story of the USS Jeannette that got trapped and crushed in the ice in the northeastern Arctic in 1879. So I read that book, and Hampton Sides, he's written a number of books that I've read. But this one, I woke up one morning, which happens sometimes, very rarely, that I had this intense dream that I came out of, and I scribbled the story down, which was called The Last Eden. And the image I had was a post-apocalyptic world that was deluged with water. And there was a couple, a stranded woman. I don't know why my women are always stranded, but stranded.
That's something that we'll discuss with a psychoanalyst.
I don't feel stranded. I mean, yeah. But in any case, I just thought of that as I'm talking. I'm like, whoa. Sorry. And a creature that is enough man-like that they can, well, he can't talk, but to contemplate whether one brings a child into this world
right
under those conditions. And so I wrote this story, and I thought, wow, that's interesting. And knowing nothing about the Arctic at that particular time, and sometimes I just wonder why things work the way they work. A friend of mine from grad school wrote about her disappointment about not being accepted to the Arctic Circle residency. And I thought, wow, there's a, residency.
There's a residency?
Yeah. So on a fluke, in fact, I was talking to my husband about this the other day. He had forgotten this, but I applied without telling him, thinking, what are the chances they'll end up in the Arctic? And when I actually got in and I told him, he was just astonished, but very supportive. He's always been supportive of every crazy idea I've ever had. And so I went, and with no project in mind. Often artists will go with a specific
something they're looking for.
project.
Yeah.
And there was only one other writer on my trip. There were choreographers, there were performance artists, dancers, sound engineers, filmmakers, a National Geographic photographer, etc. And I think when I applied, I just said, I've written this story. I'm very interested in writing more fiction set in the Arctic, but I feel I have to know more. I've always felt that way about anything I've done, that I almost can tell when something is inauthentic, that maybe you've spent a week there or a month there, and it just doesn't feel like a lived experience. And so I went on this trip, and it went along the western coast, which is bathed by the Gulf Stream, so that it's easily passable until you get into the very north part, where we did get blocked by ice. And this wasn't an icebreaker, it's a barkentine. So one of the very last landings was on a beach that was, as far as the eye could see, beluga bones. And immediately I was intrigued. It was disturbing.
Right.
But I was
intriguing nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, some of the people on the boat, what you would do is you would drop anchor at most of these landings and then take Zodiacs, because there aren't docks.
Right.
And so some people immediately hopped back in the Zodiacs and went back to the ship. But I, being a slightly morbid person, stayed. But I knew there was something there. It's strange how it was literally toward the end, and I hadn't really had any inspiration. And then I thought, what is the story here? And I went back home afterward and did research, could find almost nothing, except there were a couple of paragraphs in a cruise handbook. It's called the Cruise Handbook of Svalbard. And it said, this man named Ingvald Svensson from Tromsø had harvested beluga in the 1930s. And that was it. And so from there, I thought, well, can I, create a story around this? And I'm sure I should say right up front that my story has nothing to do with Ingvald Svensson. For all I know, he was there all by himself, harvesting beluga. I mean, I knew there were 500 to 700 beluga harvested in the 30s over, I don't know if it's the whole decade. Obviously, it ended when the war came.
Right.
Because everybody had to evacuate in 1941. But so something like 50 to 100 beluga must have been harvested every year. But I could never find, try as I might, I mean, there might be a book in Norwegian that discusses him. And I did find quite a few books in Norwegian about some of the characters who are real life people, like Hannah Resval Holmsen, who was a botanist, and Helfrid Noyes, who was a quote unquote Arctic housewife to Hilmar Noyes, who was a famous hunter. And these books were in Norwegian. And what I would do is I would take my Google Translate photo and translate each page. This took forever. And then try to make sense of the gobbledygook. One thing I will say about Google Translate, because I've had to do this more recently, doing it research for my next book, is that it seems to translate better now. Or maybe,
it's learning. It's learning. It's getting it.
Anyway.
I know that sometimes the translations are crazy. You look at it and you think, I don't think that's what they said.
Yeah.
But
yeah. You'll stumble over a word and you'll look up the word, and the word can mean what they say it means, but in a totally different context.
Different way.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. And I really, really tried to learn Norwegian before my last trip. I've been there, as I said, 3 times. Mm-hmm. I went there in 2019 and 2020, early 2020. In 2019, I wanted to feel what it felt like to live in the polar darkness. So I went there in October and November. And then
you are also a brave woman.
It's actually, again, I guess I'm strange, but you have heat and you have light, unlike these people
Right.
back in the 1930s where
Right.
they, I mean, you have whale oil lamps or whatever, but it's actually not as, well, for a writer anyhow, being inside and not really being tempted to go outside much is an ideal situation, because at that point I was actively writing.
Writing. Yeah. I guess I can see that. I am such a light person though. Like I live at the beach. I need sunshine. I, walk out every morning and, raise my arms to the sun and, feel it on my face. The idea, I could maybe do a day or two possibly, but the idea of like living in a long-term kind of situation in which I did not see the sun, oh, I think I would become depressed very quickly. And I mean, I really understood your character Astrid and what was happening with her. I thought, boy, I feel you 100%, because there's something to me that I can understand how people go crazy
Mm-hmm.
in a place where there is no day and night, and
Mm-hmm.
where and she didn't just have lack of day and night, but there were no other people. There
Right.
was nothing, her child was somewhere else, and then, in the story she's pregnant and she has all of those hormones that are going on too. And I just, yeah, like I said, it was a bit of a thriller for me, but
Yeah, I think that for me, and again, I'm in modern times.
right.
So I still didn't totally experience what she would have experienced.
Exactly.
In fact, two of the side trips I took during the winter residency, I had a guide who took me to two different places. One was totally dark. There was no moon, nothing. And that was a different experience, because when you're in town, there is still lights, there are lights lighting the
From the
road.
buildings and the,
Yeah.
right.
And then the other was during the full moon. I wanted to go out during the full moon because I knew one of the scenes would be how the moon strikes a snow-coated surface. And that in particular, like, I could appreciate the beauty, the sheer beauty of it. It's something you could, I guess you could experience it here. I live in Maine. I could go out into a rural area when there's no light in the evening, but to experience it there when you've lived in the dark for a period of weeks, and then not the moon comes out, but there's a lot of fog and overcast, so you
Right.
don't always get to experience it. But let's say you get to experience it, as I did. It's almost like the sun. It's
so
right.
bright in comparison to what
Yes,
you've been doing, that
yes.
it is now this. Yeah.
And then I and also what they do currently now. Obviously, Astrid doesn't have this experience, but people who live in the town now, they have festivals and music. I mean,
Right.
everywhere you turn around. So you don't have a whole lot of time to be bored in the town. Of course, what Astrid and Tor have is they have to fight to survive. So that occupies their day. I would imagine be, distracting, among other things. And then I also went back in February, March of 2020, because on March 8th, that's kind of nebulous, but March 8th, the sun comes peeking over the mountains, and they have a big celebration then called Solstice. And so I was there for that. In fact, I was there and had to leave when everything got shut down for COVID. Yeah. So, but in any case, and then I was just back there primarily to, I was presenting to the literature festival they host in September, but I am continuing to do some research for my next book. And I also got to go to Barentsburg, which is a Russian coal mining town still operating there.
Wow.
Which was very interesting just because of what's happening in the world right now with Russia.
Yeah.
And the fact that the coal miners there are primarily, from what I understand, Ukrainian from the Donbass. So it was very interesting to listen to the two women who led us around. Were both from St. Petersburg, and their views on the war. And, you know, they're very isolated, I think. That helps them have a different experience.
Exactly. Well, you know, and but it is true when you only know certain aspects of whatever is going on, then you hold a different view than someone who can see it from a more global standpoint.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes.
Absolutely. So one of the things I really loved was that this is kind of a dual timeline. You know, you've got Tor, and we see them back in the 30s, right, doing the beluga whale and everything else, and then we see him, is it 10 years later? Right, and so he goes back, and he's going back because he's just like filled with guilt. You did that really well. Sometimes dual timelines can get confusing for the reader, you know, and like you're not sure where you are, but I always felt like I knew where I was in the entire story. I think you did a really good job handling the back and forth.
I think it helps there with, I remember one lesson from my MFA days where they said, you know, there was an argument about, well, how much should you challenge the reader?
Right.
And
right.
I used to resist that idea of timestamping things. I thought it was, I don't know. But this time I said, no, there's just no way. There's enough going on. I mean, I was even confused. Timeline. Sometimes I'd say, no, that couldn't have happened because, you know, just one little tiny thing is when she starts feeling the baby.
Right.
And I've been pregnant, you know, so I know basically that timeline and how you feel, at least how I felt, you know, what was realistic. And I thought, no, she couldn't. At first it was that she actually did feel like a month or two into the pregnancy. I think it was 2 months. And I thought, well, I don't really think so. And I actually had to research, like, when do you feel?
Yeah, like how does
movement?
That actually? Yeah,
like, because my impression was it was pretty early in my pregnancy. So then I fudge it a little and I say she thought she felt that, or you know, whatever I did.
Right. What you did give you that, like she had that impression in her mind. But
yes. So you can sort of get away with it because there were a number of places, because it's very, the two timelines, and then you're looking at a year, and then he's also looking back on the war, which has just ended in, and also his guilt over some things that he did during the war. So all of those things have to work together. And at some point I did write down at least the key, you know, times and month. Even the month would make a difference.
Exactly. Especially when you're dealing with, like, when would the ice have come, and when would that have happened, and could they have gotten out any earlier, and all of the things that matter, because you know, you're dealing very much with weather, and misjudging the ice, that can be a few days.
Yes.
You know, and so you have to be careful of, like, when did you have that happen, right?
Yeah. One of the last things I did, although I had done it as I was writing, were just things like sunrise and sunset. When it happens in the summer, when what happens, when does it really come back? How long is the sun there on March 8th, which is not very long? How long does it take to get back to full, you know, 24-hour sun, and so forth? And one of the very last edits I did was just go through, and anytime I mentioned full moon or sun or fog,
check to be sure that could happen.
They actually have that online. You can find out.
Yes, I know. So
it's amazing.
This is crazy, because in Daughters of Green Mountain Gap, I talk a lot about full moons, because my granny woman meets with a healer from the Cherokee Nation. Okay. And they often have full moon ceremonies.
Right.
And I too went back and found out, wow, that's when the full moon would have been. And I made sure it would happen along so that my dates really fit. So I love that you did that too. I think there's really an amazing ability now with the internet to do some intense research to make these little tiny pieces real. And I doubt there's one reader out there who would have gone and looked up whether or not that was actually a full moon. But me knowing that it was made it feel more real when I was writing it.
Well, yeah. And I mean, even I know there's something that takes place on St. Lucy's Day, Santa Lucia. And I wanted there to be a full moon that night desperately, but there wasn't.
There wasn't, right.
So I had to write around that. I mean, that's it. The really interesting thing to me about historical fiction is, when do you take license and when do you not?
Exactly.
And the things that people could look up, you wouldn't believe the kinds of responses. I mean, some of them are erroneous. One of the reviews that I had, everybody seems to have loved the book, but one person said, but I just really couldn't believe that Astra would be a botanist in that time frame, and that her husband would allow her, to do what she did. And I said, there were, that's one reason why I have Hannah in there, aside from the fact that I really admired her pluck. Here's a woman who had suffered from health issues her whole life. And in 1907, I discovered this book during one of my residencies and I thought, here's a woman who goes on an expedition in 1907, having already earned a university degree in botany, with a bunch of men. Prince Albert of Monaco sponsored it, drops her with a tent and provisions and her plant press. And she's the first woman to document Svalbard flora. And that's clear in the book.
Yes.
I do say that in the beginning. So I'm thinking, well, if she can do it in 1907,
then why couldn't Astra do it 30 years later, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And
I
also think there's this really, among certain people, not that there weren't strictures on women's roles around the world, but I don't think that, I mean, I had a father, my mother worked, largely because she had to, because we were never incredibly well off growing up. And I never heard my father say anything like, oh, you can't do that, or you can't do this. And he was incredibly supportive. I have two sisters and two brothers. We were all going to college. My mother didn't go to college. My dad did, but it was never like, well, we can only afford to send the boys. And this was in the 70s.
So I agree with you that did happen. There were those families that was true, but it wasn't true across the board.
No, I agree. I agree that.
Yeah.
But to put it in the context of The Last Whaler, there was precedent.
Yes.
And
yeah.
Precedent.
And I get the same thing sometimes, where you get a review and you think, okay, I mean, that's your opinion and that's all well and good. You're wrong, but that's, I can't do anything about that, but okay. Yeah. It was funny, on my very first one, I actually got a really good review from Kirkus, except at the very end of their review, they said the end, how did they put it? Like the end seemed too convenient, essentially. The end seemed too convenient, but it wrapped things up nicely. And it made me laugh, because the ending was the only true part of the story. It was the piece that was told to me by someone that was so fascinating that I wrote 80,000 words of fiction to tell that end. I had no idea how we ever came to that place, but it was so incredible. And it made me laugh, because it was kind of like they said everything about the book was great, but that ending.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like, except that was the true part.
Well, in my other book, which I know you've read, Falling Through the New World.
Yes.
A lot of that, the factual stuff, is based on my family history. Yeah. And one of the absolute facts is that my grandmother arrived on a ship called the Vulcania on October 29th, 1929. The day, well, I mean, the stock market was doing badly, but it crashed.
That's a big day.
That day, yeah, Black Tuesday. And I remember people read early drafts of that story and said, well, this is a great story, except, this
That's
couldn't
too
possibly.
convenient. Yeah.
So, of course, one of the other little tidbits that you learn with a good teacher is that if there's something too convenient, that you have the character address how convenient it is.
Yes.
So they're
Yeah.
saying, well, you would never believe this, but not quite that
Right.
blatant,
But
but you know
and
what I mean. But
to give people
acknowledging
right.
that it's just like, who would have believed she would have arrived, because
Right.
it's through the husband's point of view, on the very day that the stock market crashed. And then you move on. Now, some people still may not believe it, but you've done everything you could as a writer. And part of my thing is to honor facts,
Me
honor
too.
what actually happened. And yes, this ship did arrive with all those immigrants from Italy. And it happened to be that day. It wasn't only my grandmother, it was the other, 300
Right.
people on the ship.
Right.
And they had to deal with the fact that they were arriving to a completely different America. And I just find that really fascinating about historical fiction, what you find out that it strains credulity sometimes, but
Yes.
that is
Yeah.
just
I love it when
fascinating.
I'm doing research and you of course you do so much research and there's so many things that never make it into the book. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
that's cool, but it's not going to move my story forward. And you're going along and all of a sudden you come on this piece of information and it's like, that's how my story is going to move forward. It's that piece right there and I love that feeling of, wow, that's the thing. And for you on that one, it was actually given to you because it was a real truth. That's
Mhm.
when your grandma, great grandma came.
Grandma. It's my grandma.
Grandma. Okay. When your grandmother came, I mean, it was on that date. And so it was
Mhm.
given to you, but to find those tidbits that are those pieces of history that can actually make it into your book. I love that. I love that feeling.
Well, it's interesting you should say that about the pieces,
Yeah.
because with The Last Whaler, with both books, but with The Last Whaler, let's focus on that. I don't ever start with an outline.
Me neither. Yeah.
And people are shocked, how did you do this? And I said, I start with research. And aside from knowing that this beach was important with the bones, what's the story? What story? So there has to be a whaler,
Yeah.
so you start researching whaling, and you start researching beluga whaling, and so on and so forth. And you learn certain things about how the whales are captured. And you say, oh, that would make a great scene, somewhere along the
Yes.
line. Or the
Yes.
belugas are highly intelligent, and some of them can even are thought to mimic human speech. Oh, that has to be in there
That
somewhere.
has to be in there somewhere. Right.
Yeah. And
Right.
so you go along. I mean, Hannah gets in there because I discover Hannah, and well, I'll make Astrid a botanist. And then I thought, well, crap, I had known nothing about botany.
Botany.
So I had to research Arctic flora. And then you find
Right.
out, how that all evolved. And piecing, as you say, piecing those pieces of research, but also making it flow into a fictional narrative without making it seeming like you are just regurgitating
Right. Right.
research.
I have a book that I read and I actually talked with the author about it because it was almost as though we had a story and we had a history book. And we went back and forth between story and history book. And it was like, oh, this could be so wonderful if you had found a way to take that history and put it into the story instead of separating me. I kept feeling like I was being taken out of the story to read some history so that I could then go back into the story. And that's something that takes a lot of practice, is figuring out how do you weave those facts that need to be in the story. How do you get them in without giving, 4 paragraphs of this is botany in the Arctic,
Yes, yes, yes. And then you can't, I mean, some things you have to just leave. I always think about, I think it was Philip Roth had a book, and I can't remember the name of it, where he goes for 5 pages about glove making. And a lot of people criticize that. And quite frankly, you could just skip those pages and
Yes.
not lose all that
Not
much. It
lose.
wasn't
Yeah.
like lovemaking became a metaphor or,
Right.
I mean, it was in the book. And so there was a lot of controversy, I remember, about that. And then there's the other extreme where James Dickey wrote To the White Sea. This is a book in the 90s. And he took, well, an American gets, his plane goes down in Japan and he's left to his own devices to get through hostile territory, like right as the war is ending. And someone said, well, how did you know? How did you write that? And he said, it's fiction. I made it up. And I don't totally believe that he didn't do some research.
Right.
But to take that, let's assume
that he really did. Right.
License. To me, that also, and I read To the White Sea years ago, so I don't even remember other than,
right.
I turned the pages. But it did make me think, like, how much license does a historical fiction writer have? How much can you get away with and just completely make up that this could not possibly have happened this way? But you need it to happen that way for the sake of the story.
Yeah, for me, facts are facts. I don't change. If I know it as a fact, I don't feel that I should change it. I just can't do that. And then my characters, if they're of my own creation, my characters can pretty much do whatever they want within the bounds of that era. Mm-hmm. So can we push the bounds a little? Can they be someone who was a little more, foregoing than normal? Can they be someone who was a little more backward than? Sure. Because you find all of those people in our society today. You have those that are, well advanced technologically speaking compared to me. And then you look at my mom, right? And like, there's this nice long continuum. So I feel comfortable, but it has to be, you can't have someone in 1890 listening to the transistor radio. I mean, there's just certain things that can't happen,
well,
right?
You could if you were writing a different sort of story.
I guess if you're writing a fantasy, but I guess that's my point, is if you're going to write historical fiction, to me, the history should be as accurate as you can make it, given you didn't live it.
Right.
You're having to base it on the research that you did, and eventually you have to stop researching. Right. Because you could just be a researcher the rest of your life and never get a book out. You have to say, this is enough to write my story.
And how do you know that? I was
you don't
with a very famous novelist whose name I won't say. And this was before I even started. I had written Badlands, which had a historical component to it. It had the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I remember writing that book, that I had read a diary of an archaeologist from that era. And somewhere in the 250 pages of this diary, there was just this one little line where he was extremely thirsty and a moth landed on it was dry and desert.
Yeah.
And a moth landed on his lips to find moisture. And I thought, wow, I just have to use that somewhere.
Right.
Had to read a 250-page book. So I'm in the beginning stages of writing The Last Whaler, knowing I have a lot of research I have to do. And she says, so someone asked her, well, how do you know, how much research to do? And her thing was, well, you don't go down, rabbit holes and this and that, like very dismissive of doing a lot of research to write a book. And I thought, I don't think, I mean, obviously at some point you have to say enough and get started.
Right.
But if that is for a little short story, that might be, a couple of books. For a novel, it might be, for me, it was 2 years. I mean, I did write that opening scene. And that pretty much stayed as it was pretty early on. But beyond that, I thought, well, this is just open up the can of worms. And the can of worms was historical research.
Right.
And I also have to say that and I've said this before, I would much prefer doing research for the rest of my life. You open up a book, you take notes, you think about the ideas, you think maybe some facts or whatever might work their way into whatever you're doing. You have a broad idea of what you're trying to do. And then you move on to the next book. And it's very comforting. I mean, I can do that. I could do that for the rest of my life. I love learning new things.
I tell people it's why I love writing historical fiction, because it marries the two things I love to do, which is research and write. And I have a hashtag that I use that says research junkie.
Oh,
and
okay.
I mean, that is what I am. And yeah, you could steal it. Absolutely. Absolutely.
But
so you alluded to it a little bit. What's coming up next, Cynthia?
Well, among other stories I discovered was the story of S.A. Andre, who in 1897 tried to take a hot air balloon over the North Pole. Back in that time, everybody was trying to be the first one to the North Pole. Right. And in fact, the two people who eventually made it, there's still a dispute about who actually made it and whatnot. Right. But in any case, and there is that whole story is fascinating, both from the polar explorer who puts their life on the line to do something like that. Why? I mean, anyone who puts their life on the line to do something, whether it's a soldier going into war, I don't really understand that. So part of my motivation is to really try to understand that, not the backstory of, did he not prepare well enough? He put two other men at risk and, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's interesting, but that's not my interest. Is always human motivation. Why would he really do this? And the other part of the story is one of the men was engaged to a woman who they were lost, and their bodies were found 33 years later. They never made it to the North Pole. And they had diaries and things that they found on this place called White Island. I won't try to pronounce the Norwegian name of it, but it's called White Island. It's one of the islands on Svalbard or in the archipelago. They took off from Danes Island and landed. Unfortunately, where they landed was very inhospitable, not a place you can really survive. And on the eastern side, where it's much colder, there's no Gulf Stream bathing it. And so they're found in 1930, their bodies, with all of these artifacts, that some of which were published. Andre's diary and Nils Strindberg, who was on the balloon and who was the one who was engaged. And then the woman he was engaged to held a torch for him, as that saying goes, until she died, even though she did get married. And so on her story, I'm just very curious. I'm not going to give too much else away.
No, don't give too much else away. I don't want you to give away things. Okay, guys. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I mean, that just, again, obsession interests me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, and you write really good books that make other people want to know more about those characters as well. So, hey guys, if you want to keep this book discussion going, head on over to Novels and Latte Book Club on Facebook. There you're going to be able to win a copy of Cynthia Reeves' book, The Last Whaler. And she's told me that she's got a hard copy for you. So will you be able to sign it, Cynthia?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so she'll sign it and send it out to you. So head right on over and look for the post that I put out there and get your chance to win. So Cynthia, if someone wanted to get up with you and talk with you about your books or being an author or what you're writing next or what you think of the Arctic or any of those things, how do they do that?
Well, anyone can reach me through my website, CynthiaReevesWriter.com. Somebody else has CynthiaReeves.com. So yeah, you have to add the writer.
Right.
And I do get messages that way. Super. I also have just an insane number of events coming up, which you can find on my website. Thus far, they're mostly confined to the East Coast. I am also going to be doing AWP in Los Angeles in March. I have a panel that has something to do with the novel, environmental writing. And I'm going to be in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, at Lemuria Books this month. So, and the other way, which I would love to do, I just did my first book club at Newport Public Library in Newport, Rhode Island. And that's my absolute favorite, because the people have read. It was strange to me because I'm so used to doing presentations where it's one-sided.
Right.
I mean, people ask questions, but not with knowledge of the book. And here they wanted to know in granular detail.
I love book clubs. To me, they are just, it's an author's dream.
Yeah, I would do them. I was physically in person. It wasn't Zoom. Obviously, you can do Zoom anywhere. Right. So if you're in some area that's not in the Northeast, where I can easily get anywhere, I'd love to do more of those. I have another one scheduled next month in Pennsylvania, which is my old stomping grounds. And I think that, to me, that's about the most fun, especially when you hear certain reactions, particularly ones you don't expect. Just how, the emotional connection. I find it interesting that, for the most part, even though it's called The Last Whaler, and to some extent it's about Tor Handelin, who is the one who goes through transformation. So technically speaking, the novel is about him. But more often than not, Astrid is the character who people
really connect with.
And especially because a lot of the people who I've talked with thus far are women. There have been men in the audience, but a lot of them are women. In fact, it's funny, the men are more interested in questions about the ship and the whaling, and
yeah, I can see
and
that.
the women are more like, well, how would you
how would Astrid have handled all of those things? I know.
Exactly. So, I mean, not that I'm trying to be sexist, but it is and I think Astrid's story, I mean, she does have a fully contained story in there too.
She does.
So it's not like she's lightly covered. Or that was the other thing that I had to decide in the very beginning when I first started writing. I had about 80 pages from Tor's point of view, and I got to about the 80th page, and I said, first of all, I thought it was a novella, and I was like, this is going to be a novel. But also, I wanted her point of view directly. How do I do that, knowing certain things that you know about the novel?
Right.
How do I accomplish that?
Right.
And I resisted it to some extent because my first book, Badlands, has an alternating husband and wife point of view.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, do I really want to go back there and do this dual narrative structure? But in the end, I sat literally for a couple of weeks resisting it, doing nothing else but resisting it. And finally I said, I'm going to make these letters, and let me see what a letter would sound like. And I wrote the first letter, and I thought, oh,
it works.
The second letter. And then I realized, okay, get over it. It's going to be a dual narrative structure.
And that's what we're going to do. I know.
You go from there.
I know. All right, guys, all the links to find Cynthia will be in the show notes. And Cynthia, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. This has been a lot of fun. It's nice to talk to a fellow historical novelist too, who understands the
little intricacies
and the joy.
Yes, that is true. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.